Chapter 3 Mythical Figures. Sturm Sepp is one of the mythical figures from our childhood. He worked on the Sturm farm next door, and he was bent forward at the hip like a 90-degree hinge. To us, he was a giant of a man, a holdout from some grey, unknowable past. He had a great grey shovel beard and usually an equally extensive pipe dangling from his mouth. We could tell from his bicycle how tall he must be if he were straightened out. The saddle was so much higher than the frame that only a giant could possibly reach the pedals from there. Sturm Sepp was silent. No one had ever heard him speak a word. On Sunday at the pub, his mug of beer was put down for him without his having to order it. We little ones pestered him, and on the way to school, when he was scything the pasture on the other side of the fence, hunched over like some primordial being, we called out, "Morning, Sepp," and kept on trying to get a word out of him. One time, even though he seemed to be mowing perfectly placidly, he suddenly swung his scythe at Brigitte, the girl from the Berger farm, who was the closest to the fence, and caught her amidships. "Oi, you!" he called, his only verbal expression in decades. It was just as well that the point of the scythe struck the tin for her school lunch. From then on, though, we kept our distance. We calculated that the reason Sturm Sepp was so strong and so horribly doubled over was because in winter he would lug tree trunks down from the forest. Once, when his horse had broken down, he had shouldered a colossal tree, and from that day forth he was bent double. He was far from being the only mystery around. I'm not sure if this is a memory or not, but I seem to see the outline of a man standing by the stream behind the house as it got dark. Against the cold, he has lit a mighty fire, strong enough to paint his face scarlet. He's staring into the flames. Someone says he's a deserter fleeing into the mountains. Could I have remembered such a thing? Was I not too young? There was also a witch who came for me, but my mother caught up to her and snatched me back. And from that time on, I knew I wouldn't wet my pants anymore, but get to the potty on time. On my right hand, I had a mark where the witch had bitten me. Then there was a night, which certainly happened, when our mother roused Till and me from our beds and wrapped us in blankets because it was still so bitterly cold outside. She climbed up the slope with us, some way to a place where there was a view. "You've got to see this, boys," she said. "Rosenheim is on fire." Toward the end of the war, Rosenheim was set ablaze, as they said, by Allied bombers on their way back to their bases on the other side of the Alps, having been unable to make out their targets on account of bad weather. It was said they dropped their payload over the nearest enemy German city to lose some weight. I can still see before me what met my eyes as a child. At the end of the valley to the north, the whole sky was red and orange and yellow. But there were no flickering flames, only a slow pulsing of the firmament, because Rosenheim, 40 kilometers away, was embers. It was a vast inferno, tracing the terrible pulse of the end of the world on the night sky. At the time, Rosenheim meant nothing to me, but from that moment on I knew that outside of our tight valley there was a whole world that was dangerous and spectral. Not that I was afraid of it. I was curious to know it. One riddle that still occupies me to this day was an airplane that spent a long time circling over the mountain behind the house, as though looking for something. Then, as we could clearly see, it dropped something shiny and mechanical, maybe aluminum. I can't remember if it was on a parachute or some kind of balloon. It was marked by a flag and seemed to drift from one treetop to the next. The people down in the valley could see it too, but because it was already getting dark, it wasn't until the next morning that a search party of men set out to locate it. They were gone all day, and it was almost dark when they returned from the mountain. We were all dying to know what it was, but no one would tell us. Something mysterious had been found, but we weren't allowed to know what. Was it something of a military nature? Was it even from this world or another entirely? The idyllic landscape of Sachrang had dangers of its own. Years after the war ended, we were still finding weapons that had been thrown away or hidden by fleeing soldiers. When Germany, completely surrounded, kept shriveling in the face of advancing Allied troops, there were only a very few tiny unoccupied enclaves remaining. One in Thuringia, I think, one in the north near Flensburg, and almost the last of them was Sachrang with Kufstein just across the border in Austria and the nearby Kaiser Mountains. A last few dispersed troops, but also groups of so-called werewolves who intended to conduct partisan operations after the end of the war, came this way, threw off their uniforms, and swapped them in return for civvies. They hid their weapons in hay heaps or wood piles. I know from my mother that there was once a big kerfuffle on the Berger farm when American occupation soldiers found rifles in the big barn there. The farmer was threatened with shooting, and my mother, who spoke some English, intervened on his behalf. He hadn't, it seemed, known anything about the concealed arms. I myself found a submachine gun under a woodpile. I'm not sure if I fired it or not.